Welcome to the Vancouver Writers Fest's Books and Idea Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers Fest's 2021 festival season. This event is presented in partnership with SFU's Master of Publishing program. The Vancouver Writers Fest carries out its work and this event here today on the traditional, unceded, and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We are grateful to be here and are cognizant of the history of these lands and the necessary and urgent work that is still to come as we move toward reconciliation and Indigenous sovereignty. Today, we are honored to be hosting award-winning Nishga author Jordan Abel in conversation with celebrated journalist and author Tanya Talaga. As author David Sheriandi put it, Jordan's new book, Nishga, is a book of profound artistic, philosophic, and emotional power. Reading it, I was taught, heart-moved, and deeply humbled. Nishga is a piece of art and an autobiographical meditation that attempts to address the complicated legacy of Canada's residential school system and contemporary Indigenous existence. And now, on to the event. Your host today is Tanya Talaga. Tanya is an Anishinaabe journalist and speaker. She's worked for the Toronto Star and now the Globe and Mail, being nominated 5 times for the Michener Award in Public Service Journalism. Her first book, Seven Fallen Feathers, is a national bestseller, winning multiple nonfiction and writing awards. And her second book, All Our Relations, Finding the Path Forward, is also a national bestseller and award nominee. She's a Massey lecturer, honorary doctorate, and the CEO of Makwa Creative, a production company focused on Indigenous storytelling. She's also a former guest curator at this festival. And Jordan Abel. In an interview with Calgary Herald, Jordan Abel laments this book is a book that I really wish someone else had written so I could learn from it, but that's not the situation we're in. An award-winning Nishga poet, Abel steps up for all of us to confront painful truths with a deeply personal autobiographical meditation. Nishga explores the complexity of the Indigenous experience, speaking on residential schools and intergenerational trauma with an innovative meld of artistic interpretation and historical evidence. Nishga might ask more questions than it answers, but it all contributes to an imperative conversation, one we look forward to being a part of today. Please welcome Tanya Talaga and Jordan Abel.
Bonjour. Tanya Talaga Nigisnikas kam musko pimoshishet pinishish Nigisnikas. I'm so thrilled to be here today. I'm coming to you today from Takaranto, home of the Mississaugas of the Credit traditional territory, the Haudenosaunee and the Huron-Wendat people. I'm so excited to be leading this discussion with Jordan Abel. I love Jordan. It's true. I do, you know.
I'm also here.
I love the work that Jordan does. And I remember being captivated by you by hearing you read. And also to meeting with you when my first book, Seven, came out. We had a discussion at the Winnipeg Library. And it was a really special, it was a special time for me. And I am so grateful that you took the time to meet with me. And then you showed me around the U of M. I am grateful for your kindness and your friendship. And so it was an honor to receive your book. It was actually sent to me as soon as it came out.
Oh, wow.
I know Jared Bland sent it to me and with a note saying, I hope you enjoyed this book. And it's absolutely beautiful. Congratulations.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
It must have been, I know everyone always probably starts conversations like this, but I've got 2 things that I wanted to start with you, actually. I wanted you to introduce yourself to us.
Sure. My name is Jordan Abel. Right now, I am in Edmonton on Treaty 6 territory. I think for the purposes of this book, I often introduce myself as a Niska author, um, and within the first 20 pages, 10 pages or so of this book, I think that gets exploded a little bit, and instead maybe it would be useful to say at the outset here that I'm an intergenerational survivor of residential schools, and an urban Indigenous person. And, well, my my family is Niska, and from the Niska Nation. I think I primarily, think of myself as having this kind of triangulation of, urban indigeneity, Niskaness, and intergenerational survivor as the three things that's underpin my identity and my relationship to indigeneity.
Beautifully said. And that is exactly why I asked you to introduce yourself. I knew it was a loaded question.
Totally.
And the subject of your book, the one of the subjects of your book, I think that writing a memoir is incredibly brave. And I just want to say that you are brave. You're brave for writing this book and telling your truths and telling them so honestly and beautifully. Because it's not easy, is it? It's not easy. It's like it's not easy. So I actually wanted to start off by asking you a question about the formation of this book.
Sure.
Where did it come from? And how long has it been living inside your mind?
Totally. I think that's such an important question to start out with, and the really short answer is, for the entirety of my being here, on this earth, I think, um, this book, has really, lingered with me all my life, and in particular, I would say, some of the questions that that the book begins with, are questions that really, shape the entirety of the work, and those questions being, what does it mean to be Indigenous but to be dispossessed from your home territory? What does it mean to be an intergenerational survivor of residential schools? What does
Mhm.
it mean to be dispossessed of both uh, Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous land? And how do you navigate the world as an urban Indigenous person, who's constantly being asked what your relationship to your home territory is? And maybe like further than that, how do you think through a relationship to a home territory that is absence, and that is um, severed from you in some way? So those questions uh, are are have been deeply important to me throughout my entire life. Um, Not that I've been able to articulate them like that, throughout the entirety of my life. Like, it took me a long while to figure out how to ask those questions, uh, and to find the words to put to those questions. But those questions were still there, lingering with me before that moment. um, and I was just struggling with them and trying to find answers, even when I couldn't properly ask those questions or answer them. And in that way, I would say this book is absolutely a lifelong project, and also one that is not so much timely as it is overdue. um so when so part of the way this book came together was through my work in SFU's PhD program in their English departments, and that was a really important moment for me, important and generative moment for me as a writer, because anytime you do something like that, there's all of these artificial moments, of deadlines, and dates and importance, goalposts that you have to hit. And I think, in some ways, that construct, I think, really catalyzed the beginning of catalyzed the process of writing the book, and that process kind of snowballed into the book that you have in front of you.
Mm. Talk to me about how you physically put the book together too. I mean, it's absolutely stunning. I love how you used notes, and in your notes are just like, these are like notes of a life, right? They're just these memories that you've had, things that have happened to you in your life. And then talk to me about how the photographs, the screens, the physical layout of the book is something to behold.
Yeah, and I'm so glad. I'm so glad it spoke to you. I think this is part of the book that, I really, if you've for those of you listening who have seen some of my other work, you know that I'm a very visual
Yes.
writer in many
Yes.
ways,
Mhm.
and literally visual, where I'm often, thinking about image and photography and whatnot. So the book came together in this very particular way. So it started, with those questions, and I often, think about this work as a problem-based work, where really I was, you know, trying my best to provide an answer that was nuanced and complicated to all of those questions I was just asking, um, and that was a really difficult thing to do in many ways. So part of the way that I began to find my way into it was by going through my family archive. So I had this box of documents and photographs that my mom gave to me at some points, and many of the several of the documents, I should say, ended up, appearing in the book. But my first interaction, with that archival box was to go through every document, was to read everything I could, and look at all the photographs, and try and piece together these moments that had these enormous impacts on my life, that I was unfamiliar, unfamiliar with in some cases, before reading through some of those documents. So the way the book began, was by transcribing some of those documents and positioning them, in um, in an InDesign file, and just trying to, as I say at the end of the book, part of that process was just trying to hold up all the pieces and see how they all fit together. So part of my work as a writer was, you know, partly also the work of curation, where I was just singling out certain documents and certain moments and certain photographs, and seeing where they aligned in relation to each other. And that's also, um, how the photography and the screenshots and the images, came to be part of the book. That, as I was going through those documents, there were many textual moments, that came from, court documents, for example, court affidavits, um, uh, or other, handwritten documents from my mom, or specific Nishga eligibility criteria, et cetera. So there's like a whole bunch of things in there. But there was also all of these photographs of my mom and my dad, and of my dad's artwork. And my dad's is a painter and a carver, and he did all kinds of visual artwork. And as I was going through those images, I really felt like I needed to include them, that they were part of the story somehow. And
Mhm.
as I progressed in, into the process of writing the book, it
Mhm.
also became really important for me to put my own work in dialogue with my dad's work,
Mhm.
to create a moments of intergenerational collaboration,
Mhm.
and then to circle back to uh, the one of the origin points of your question. I also ended up putting all of these photographs of the Kukwalitsa residential school, which is where both of my grandparents on my dad's side attended.
Mhm.
And then I put in all of these screenshots. um, and part of that particular section, uh, was about trying to articulate a moment and a thing and a feeling that I was unable to articulate through words, but I
Mhm.
could talk about it through image in some way.
Mhm.
So maybe uh, there's
Mhm.
sections of screenshots, in some ways, represents or point to, uh, you know, uh, my many failings as a prose writer.
Mhm. Mhm.
And instead, point to these other, like, strengths that I have as a visual writer, or a poet, or something.
Mhm. I love, or I find it incredibly haunting and an incredible device to dislocation, the dislocation, the prints, the notes, the time stamps. It's like the scatterings of one's life and the dislocation of one's life. And, our people were violently separated from the land. Um, Colonization did that, and the policies, the arbitrary policies of the Canadian government, who decides who's Indigenous and who's not. And, I was really struck by that with reading your book. For instance, a little example of that is when you stand in front of a totem pole at the Royal Ontario Museum.
Right. Yeah. I think that was such an incredibly difficult moment for me, as just a human being, to be, reunited in some ways, with this totem pole that was, stolen from my community, and also from my life. I think, there's an absence there in it that I lived with, that I continue to live with, that, is indefinable in some ways.
Mhm.
um I wrote about that section, of, encountering that totem pole. um I first wrote about about that encounter in my first book, The Places Scraps. and and that book, makes this appearance in Nishga, that I think you know uh is important for me as a writer. Because this work is, in some ways, about circling back to my previous writings. And so the note sections that you point to,
Mhm.
those snippets of creative nonfiction where I reflect on, you know uh, often, through vignette, like particular moments that and particular encounters that I have in my life. Those, like those kinds of creative nonfiction moments, I think were present, but maybe less prominent in the place of scraps. And so, I see that work as kind of continuing a trajectory, um, in part that I started, um, much earlier in my career. But the timestamps, and the transcripts of academic talks, I think those were really, a new moment for me, and and a and one that, I struggled with at certain times. So so each so the book, uh, has, I think, maybe four or five, transcribed academic talks, and instead of positioning, those prose essays, on the page, I instead transcribed the an audio recording from each of those talks, and then reposition that audio, with specific timestamps, uh, so that the reader can, hopefully, encounter those particular words as being, words that were spoken publicly at a particular moment in time, at a particular place, that have, particular pauses,
Yes.
and,
Yes.
particular spaces that are open to them.
Mhm, mhm. And it's, it's um, so devastatingly clear and so devastatingly human, the experiences you have, and they're so personal. And so in memoir writing, it's so difficult. And I think the use of the smaller notes and the reflections and the timestamps, it makes it even more intimate and more urgent. For instance, your Catherine Abel excerpt from a handwritten notebook, and seeing some of those notes from her, it's just riveting. And you're there, and I that must have been so difficult for you to read from her.
Yeah, it was honestly really devastating in many moments, particularly those notes from my mom, that I had transcribed, you know, um, in part because, I'd heard versions of those stories and versions of those events, as they're, filtered, through her, over a series of many years, and I think one of the things that happens, when you hear a story over and over again, throughout your life is, you kind of just sometimes, you kind of just, remember the main pieces of it, and like the details fall away a bit. and
Mhm.
and so to encounter those particular moments, and, you know in, and, there's, there are many very specific moments, in there that are about my mom and my dad, and,
Mhm.
and this, uh a series of, like, really deeply impactful events that happened, between them, and, for my dad in particular, and, trying to find a way to write about those, and trying to find a way to think about, all the things that happened, as
Mhm.
part of a longer history, which was to say that, part of the arguments that I'm making, in this book, is to say that, some of those violences, um, particularly, the ones uh, that, center around my dad, you know, probably should be talked about in relation to residential school violence and in relation to violences that originated in my grandparents' generation, and trying to understand that, um, and also trying to understand my dad, and trying to understand some of those early moments in my life that I didn't you know uh, that I wasn't even old enough to commit to memory.
Yeah.
um and yeah, I think that was you know I would, if I'm being totally honest, I would say the writing process for this book was deeply wounding for me at many different moments. And I did very much consider uh, not moving forwards, with the writing of this book,
Mhm.
at so many different moments, just because it felt too overwhelming. It felt too personal. It,
Mhm.
it felt like, you know, just, it, yeah, it just felt painful sometimes to open up the document on my computer and try to add more to it, and it felt especially painful to do so in some ways, under under this, with the scrutiny of advisors, or supervisors, in an academic setting. um, and that part was so difficult. um, but I think there were moments, that I in the writing process that propelled me forward. And I think one of those moments. So I started writing this book in my PhD, um, and I was in the midst of, I just kind of finished writing the first draft, so to speak, or like the very first initial draft, like the first 80, 100 pages. uh, and and then I took this role as the writer in residence at the University of Manitoba. And I went to this writers festival in Ontario, and I met you, and I read your book Seven Fallen Feathers, and I thought that it was so incredible in so many ways, and spoke to so many similar things that I saw happening, in my own life,
Mhm.
and spoke to, it spoke to a deep colonial history that I really felt was
Mhm.
important, to always keep in mind. And
Mhm.
that book for me, was one of the ones that propelled me forward, that I felt like, you know, I had a touchstone to point to say that, you know, Tanya did this writing and it was wonderful, and that, I could, you know, I could come at this problem, and this problem of talking about what it means to be an intergenerational survivor of residential schools, what it means to exist in the wake of that violence, that I
Mhm.
could come at that problem, you know, um, from my own personal direction and vectors, and that that would that would be a pathway forward.
Chimigwech for that. I'm grateful and honored that you had that connection with my writing, and you also felt that connection as well, that I have with intergenerational trauma, and and it definitely fuels everything that I do. I think that that's who we are as First Nations people, and and we're complicated, right? As you
Yeah.
know, it's just like, yeah, this whole book is about this. I'm like reading this book. And it's interesting. And also too, Jesse Wente's book that I'm speaking to him about for the Writers Fest as well. I see versions of myself in both of these books. Like I get it. Like I'm like, oh yeah, I get that feeling of absence from community and from land, and not knowing who you are and how you explain it. You know, you had so much I want to talk to you about with that. It's just, I get it. I get it. It's almost like, you know, you always feel like, are you Indian enough? Right?
Totally. Yeah.
Like, and it's, and there's lateral violence in our communities that makes you feel like that sometimes.
Yeah,
And it's like,
absolutely.
you don't get it all the time, but it's there. And that violence though comes from the schools, that comes from those policies, right? And it's devastating. It truly is, you know. And just on that point, your exchange with Chief Robert Joseph.
Right. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah, that was a devastating moment for me. And for those of you who haven't read that part of it, the exchange is really short. I actually I can
You should,
I can read it,
I think you
if
should read it. I think you should read it. I've got it marked here. Let's see, where
okay.
is it? I can tell you what
It's
page it's
on
on.
page 36, I think.
Okay, yes, yes.
So I'll just read this very short section. A few years ago, during the city of Vancouver's Year of Reconciliation events, I was at a dinner meeting at a restaurant on Water Street. I was one of a few poets that was commissioned to write a poem in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The initiative was called Reconciliation Through Poetry. The work that the poets were engaging with was meant to honor the work of Chief Robert Joseph. At the dinner meeting, the poets, along with a few administrators, talked with Chief Robert Joseph, exchanged stories, and discussed what reconciliation meant for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. After a while, Chief Joseph directed his attention to me and asked me where I was from. I told him that I was Nishga and that my grandparents were from Kincolith. After a few moments, he said, "You're not really Nishga. Some of my friends are Nishga. Do you know how I can tell? If you were really Nishga, you would have said Niska with a K sound. Niska. You said Nishga with an SH sound." I didn't really know how to respond to that. My grandparents are Niska, my dad is Niska, but to a certain extent he was right. I wasn't born in Kincolith, I was born in Vancouver, moved when I was very young, and essentially grew up in Ontario. Does that make me less Niska?
Oh, yeah.
I I find that encounter to be so puncturing, in so many ways. And I think I think part of the difficulty too is that, it's not the first and only encounter, it's one in a series of many encounters, that I've had with folks, who, uh, you know, really, want to draw very specific boundaries around what it means to be Indigenous,
Mhm.
and want to say that there are, you know, that there is, just maybe like one very specific way to be Indigenous, and I think I think that was so difficult for me, you
Oh,
know.
absolutely. My heart broke
Yeah.
for you. My heart broke when I was reading that, you know, because language is so important to who we are. And I don't know my language. You know, I think I now know about maybe 10 words if I'm lucky, and phrases. And it sounds familiar to my ear, but so foreign to my tongue. You know, it's so difficult to to navigate that. And you feel so helpless and sad. All these emotions are wrapped up in that, because that was something that was stolen from you that's generations stolen, right? That's stolen because with what happened to your grandparents
Yes.
in the schools, and then it's all the heaped on trauma. And then there are so many of us that grew up totally disconnected from community and grew up in cities. From, and if you're a mixed person like me, I mean, my father was Polish, you grow up in Ontario or in Toronto, a big city where there's a lot of people that come from different backgrounds. Struggling to find who you are and connect with community is such a difficult thing. And then,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, no, I think even just that phrase, like, I don't speak my language, like that's, there's, you know, I think, just like thinking of it like, my language as this thing that should be intimately, a part of me, that should be connected to me, that's missing, and,
Yes.
you know, I think, you're right, I think, I think we're so often asked, to, you know, to connect, with their languages, to return to
Mhm.
traditional knowledges, and to return to speaking to each other, and other non-indigenous peoples, through our languages. And I totally believe in that, 100%. And at the same time, I want to point to the difficulties, in finding those pathways forward, finding pathways back to language, back to culture, back to what others, including folks like Leanne Simpson, have described as
Mhm.
Indigenous resurgence,
Mhm.
and I think in many ways I think that's the pathway forward, and at the same time, I think we have to be so incredibly kind to each other, and
Mhm.
and understanding, you know and of each other, about how deeply colonialism and genocide have impacted us and our relationships to communities and to access to knowledge and language.
Mhm. Absolutely, absolutely. I had a discussion with Lee Miracle. She gave the Margaret Lawrence lecture recently, and I urge you to listen to it because she just punched a big old hole through the Margaret Lawrence lectures. It
Amazing.
was incredible. And and she was talking about that, and she just, of course, blew my mind as she always does. She was talking about how we are even telling our stories in the language of the colonizers. I'm speaking to you in English, right? And the stories of the land. If you want to know the stories of Canada, you have to know the stories of the land, and that's from our nations, right? From where our families are from. And there's that disconnect. We don't speak our languages, so. And she was making those points, and I was just feeling everything she was saying. And I see it echoed in your work. I see it echoed all over. Um, and so I just want you to know that there's lots of us out there like you.
I truly appreciate that, really. And I I think, in so many ways, I think that that's the core of this book too, that so many of us feel this way or have these experiences or are disconnected, by no fault of our own, from community, and that we don't talk about those experiences nearly enough. I think, they're not normalized in the same ways that other Indigenous experiences are normalized. And, I really, you know, I I wrote this book, or I continued to write this book, in part because I kept feeling that this was an area of silence, you know, um, in our in our communities and in our writings even, and that we and that my my thinking and my approach to all of this, has just been, trying to be one of openness and transparency, and just to um, relay my experiences, as openly and as transparently as I can. And,
Mhm.
you know, and in part because I'm sure there are many, many others, who may be listening to this podcast, who feel in like they're in a similar position, but without the words to put to it.
Mm. The Miracle also said something to me once, and it really made me think and appreciate her, and also trusting that instinct of being an Anishinaabe storyteller that's inside of me that you just have to listen to. And she said, your writing is circular. You loop into the future, you go to the past, and you come to the present. You see all those things when you write. And that is the mark of First Nations writer.
Wow, that really speaks to me right at this current moment, actually. I, so at the very end of Nishga, I kind of, gesture towards my next project. It's just this project called Empty Spaces, which is so much about returning to and circling back around, and just, being in that cycle of constantly looping back and moving forward and then looping back again. And yeah, that really resonates with me.
And that is a perfect way to leave this conversation circular, looking forwards, backwards, and in the present all in the same time.
Yes, absolutely, all together.
Mm. This has been a beautiful, beautiful conversation. I'm looking forward to the day where I can see you in person.
Absolutely, hopefully sometime soon. Got my fingers crossed.
Yes, yes, yes. And Chimigwech for all of your words.
Thank you so much, Tanya. This has been amazing. I'm really appreciative of being in conversation with you.
As soon as I was offered, I'm like, yes, I would love to.
Amazing.
Thank you, Jordan and Tanya, very much for joining us on Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers Fest. We're very honored to have you here today.